Hey everybody, I wanted to take a few moments to share about our recent missions trip to El Salvador this summer. It all started this journey about 5 years ago at this school where you see me standing here now at Orangewood Christian School. Started coaching soccer here and developing relationships with these boys. And this summer we took them on a missions trip. We recently won the state championship and we decided to do something fun and something that was going to take them in deeper in their walk with God. So we went to El Salvador. And many of you all know that we go there a lot. And this summer we went and did a lot of the things we've done before, but we added soccer. And soccer is an incredible tool to share the gospel. So I want to share with you a few highlights of our trip. So we fly in there and we arrive to the base, and the very first day we go to this school. And at this school, we do a school assembly, we do our juggling and soccer, give out prizes, visit the classrooms. At the end of this school, we ask if there's anything they have need of for prayer. And the principal comes up and says to us, it hasn't rained in 30 days in our village. We have a drought. And if you don't know, this village is their economy is based upon corn, and without rain, they can't harvest their crops. They're really concerned. So that day we prayed, and all of a sudden that night, for the first time in a long time, it started to rain. And we were just so overjoyed because it poured and poured that night. We knew God answered our prayers. And then later that night, we went and did a soccer tournament in this area called Teotepeque. And after the tournament, we did a healing service, a church service at the neighboring church by the field. And the pastor allowed me to preach and pray for the sick. And at the end of the service, I did an altar call for salvation. And it was so cool because something happened that I totally didn't expect. 2 of my Orangewood soccer players stood up to receive Christ. You can imagine my amazement at that moment. But I was overjoyed. Not only that, but one other young man, this kid named Selvin, received Christ. Now while I was preaching during the service, the Lord started speaking to me about this guy and that he had an issue of pain in his body. And so I spoke to him during the service, and he came forward and received Christ, and we prayed for him, the whole soccer team. So imagine this picture. 2 of my Orangewood players give life to Christ. The whole team's gathered around after this time of rejoicing that their players and their friends came to Jesus. Now we're all praying for this kid, Selvin. And he had a pain. Come to find out, he had fallen off his horse 6 months ago. Had major pain like in his shoulder, like in his collarbone, and in his chest area. And Selvin came forward, we prayed for him, and all of a sudden his face went from pain to like shock, like pushing on his chest, and he couldn't imagine what happened. He's like, there's no more pain. And I said, well, push it. He starts pushing it, and he's like, it's gone. I said, well, hit it. And he goes this, he starts hitting it. The pain was totally gone. His face, with tears in his eyes, was saying, thank you. He was totally healed. Not only did he come to Christ, he was totally healed. What I found out was that he would never go into a church. That was the first time he'd ever walked to the door of a church. And the game of soccer brought him in, and he gave his heart to Christ. I don't know about you, but I rejoice in that. Another lady in that service came forward with rheumatoid arthritis. Her hands were literally almost stuck shut. She couldn't move her wrists or arms at all. She was in pain. We prayed for her, and the Holy Spirit touched her. She began to shout out and rejoice, and she started moving her wrists, moving her hands like this, and God had totally healed her. Those are just a few of the many miracles that took place that first day. The next day we went to an orphanage and loved on some kids, played soccer with them, toured the facility, and it was so cool to see my soccer players share their stories and testimonies and share the gospel and the message of hope with these orphans. And to see the joy these kids had was amazing because they have so little, but yet they have so much. We had Jesus. And then the next day we went and did some school assemblies. We were promoting a soccer tournament over in the city called La Libertad, which is the main area where the village is located. The first school we went into was a bigger school, and I looked at some of our players and said, okay, you're up. They're like, Coach, how many kids are here? I said, about 900. They're like, what? I'm like, come on, you can do it. They got out there, shared their story, shared the gospel, and over 30 young people prayed and raised their hand and received Christ right there in the school. It was an amazing moment. But one of my favorite highlights of the whole trip was the second school we went to. We played soccer, we We did a little juggling competition, gave out soccer balls, and then I shared my story and preached the gospel. And in that moment, the Holy Spirit fell and touched that school. 60 young people came on the basketball court, which is also their soccer field. And you could see these kids receiving Christ. And we were praying for them and their families, and they're crying. And God was just pouring out His love, pouring out His hope, pouring out His Spirit upon these young people. It was a life-changing moment for me and all of our players to see God move right there in a school in the middle of El Salvador. It was incredible. And then the next day, I had the privilege of going to the cancer center. And this cancer center, we went with our friends Jonathan and Alicia Front, our missionary friends. Now they have a ministry called Wigs of Hope as well, and they go and they give these wigs to these kids who've lost all their hair. People cut their hair and they sew it to this little beanie they crochet, and they put this little wig of hope on this these little girls who've lost their hair. And this little girl, Brianna, we went and saw this little girl, and one of our young ladies, my wife mentors at her school, had cut in her hair, and we sewed that into a wig, and we put that on Brianna's head. It was amazing to see the smile that came on her face when she saw herself in the mirror. And we got to pray for these families and love on them. And I went to the cancer center and talked to several young boys and got a chance to share the message of Christ with them and pray with them. And I gave them these Orlando City soccer stickers because one of their players from El Salvador, Darwin Sarin, is one of the players for Orlando City. And they all knew who he was and knew the Orlando City team, and they were excited to see these stickers. So we got a chance to love on families and encourage these kids who are fighting for their life with cancer. And we were praying and believing for Jesus' touch upon their life. Another highlight was after these school assemblies to promote the tournament. We played in this tournament, and we played against 3 teams, and it was supposed to be mostly high school, but there's a lot of 20-somethings as well. And at the end of this tournament, I talked to the director, and he said something to me. He said, "Tim, this was an incredible event because you guys share the message of hope and Jesus these kids need to hear." See, before the tournament started, we said we have to share the gospel. So my coach and my friend, Jeff Johnson, shared his story. It was an amazing moment. And afterwards, when this sports director for the city told me, he said, "Tim, 60% of these players you guys played against are involved in drugs and alcohol. And many of them are involved in gangs." He's like, they needed to hear this message. Thank you for coming to share this message of hope and the message of Christ with these young people. So that was an incredible moment as well. And then the next day we went and we had a time with Jonathan and Alicia Ferrant at their church plant. And they're right there in the village, they have this little church they do, which is mostly kids. We did a soccer little camp with them, little juggling and heading competition and fun, and we passed out food and fed the village. And what was amazing is at the end of the service, we did a time for praying for the sick. And this one lady came up, and I recognized her because a couple days before, we had gone up in the village and went hiking. And I say hiking, was really walking in through these roads with rocks and up the hills, and we went to these little houses, dirt floor houses with these tin roofs, just going and praying for the sick. And this one lady we prayed for, she had had migraines for 8 days. She was puking, she was dizzy, and she had no answer. We said, "Have you been to the doctor?" She said, "I couldn't afford to go to the doctor. I have no way to get there." So her only answer was Jesus. So we went in there, she believed in faith with us, we prayed for her, and we didn't know what happened to her. That was on that Thursday. That Sunday morning, she shows up at Jonathan's church right by the village, where we're doing the feeding program and playing at the doing soccer with the kids. She comes in there bringing her son, and she tells us that God healed her that day and that she wants to pray for her son as well. Her son was having issues with his eyes. Tears would continue to roll down his cheeks uncontrollably. In that moment, we prayed for her son as well because God had healed her and she had faith for her son. So when we prayed for her, all of a sudden the tears stopped flowing for the first time in months. And after we prayed, I did see one little tear, but half an hour later, he still had no tears. Now, I'm not sure what's happened since then, but all I know is that this lady was healed and that God just touched her son as well. So those are just a few of the stories that happened on our trip. And we want to thank you for supporting us. We want to thank you for sending us to this country of El Salvador. As you know, this is another home of ours, being that's where Carla's from. We have a heart for those people. And I can tell you this, the greatest testimony was that our young people, America's youth, the soccer players from Orangewood, that God's given me the privilege to mentor, their lives were forever changed. These kids, after the trip, were sharing story after story how God impacted their faith, how their faith became real this trip, how God spoke to them, how God ministered to them and became alive to Him. One of the greatest tools to mentor a youth of America is to take them on a missions trip. And that's what we did this last summer. So I want to thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for your prayers, for your finances, and for sending us. Because of you, this last summer we saw over 100 people come to Jesus in the schools, the orphanage, and on a soccer field. Thank you for sharing the message of Jesus Christ around the world with us.